Frank Sinatra and Stormy Weather. And we have storms, and we have snow, and we have rain, and we have fog, and we have mist, and we have wind, and we have all of those, although we tend to have them in a fairly moderate form, which is a bit surprising, really, because we seem obsessed with it. What we're discussing, obviously, is weather, and the reason for that is this new book called The Story of the British and Their Weather, From Frost Fairs to Indian Summers, by Patrick Nobbs, who's here with us now. Patrick, welcome to BBC London.
Thank you very much.
Is there a slight sort of, I don't know, dichotomy, I can't work out what the right word is here, that for a very temperate land we seem obsessed with the weather?
I think that's probably the answer, is that it's a temperate land, and I think the weather changes dramatically from day to day.
Never that dramatically. I mean, I'm watching New York now, and we don't often get that sort of stuff.
I suppose it's all relative. I think if you live on a continent like the States, you've got to get what comes: hot summers, much colder winters, blizzards. And I was looking back, and they have had far worse blizzards than that. 1888, I think, was probably the worst one, where they had, I think I picked up a drift of 52 feet or 16 metres.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's in America?
That was in the States. That was in New York State, I think.
Which is, New York's in the wrong place entirely, because it seems to get really terrible weather almost all, it's either too hot or too cold all the time.
Yeah, I think anybody who lives there, I mean, that's the first time I ever experienced air conditioning was when I went to New York for the first time, with good reason, because the summers are hot, they're humid, they're steamy, and the winters are freezing.
And we were hearing earlier on, because we spoke to Dr. Stephen Lewis from the Department of Physical Sciences, that the reason we don't get that is the fact that we are this island sitting in a relatively warm pool of water, and the I was going to call it the Silk Stream, but that's not the right word.
The Gulf
Stream. The Silk Stream is this pond near where I used to live. That protects us from all of that. But we do get weather, don't we?
Yes. I think it's probably less common and less frequent than it is in the States. But I think, with reference particularly to cold winters, there's a feeling at the moment that it's basically a north-south divide. But all the exceptional winters we have had have really centred themselves on the southeast of England.
Really?
That's because when you get a large high-pressure system, all the weather piles in from the east. And if anybody remembers January 1987...
Which I do.
Particularly in London, London got a battering because the wind blew off a relatively warm sea, and it was bitterly cold Scandinavian air, and showers formed directly over London. So the Thames Estuary had, I think, 30 inches of snow.
Wow.
And parts of, like Sevenoaks, where I'm from, though that whole North Downs area and to the north of London, got enormous drifts. So I think 20 feet in places.
We got pretty bad snow quite recently, didn't we? I mean, or bad or good, depending on how you look at these things.
I think 2010 was the last sort of surprise, and that was a very cold March. And that was the spring. I don't know if people remember that, but it just went on, snowing. I think at the beginning of April it was still snowing in London. And
how unusual is that? You know, there is a Prince song, which I've just remembered, Sometimes It Snows in April. How unusual is that?
It's becoming more unusual, and I would have said over the last 100 years there's been a significant change in the season. So things are... cold weather is getting less frequent. And the British climate is definitely warming, and statistically you can see how that's evident even in our lifetimes, which is...
But as you said, we had very cold... I mean, I know these things don't work like that, but we had very, very cold winters and very cold snow 4 years ago.
Exactly. I think a lot of it's linked, actually, because climate-wise it's warming significantly, but the manifestation, which is weather, means that, for example, as the poles warm significantly... the difference between the Atlantic and the poles, which is what drives the cyclogenesis, the weather, is getting less and less. And so you're getting a much slacker jet stream. So when we do get patterns, they get stuck. And that happened last year in 2013-14 winter, where we just got gales after gales. So you had the big... dip in the jet stream that blasted straight over the UK, and it just didn't change. And I think that was an unexpected sort of global warming or sort of climate change impact, and I think we're finding these things all the time.
What was the coldest or worst winter in living memory? 63 comes up a lot with sort of people of my age and a little bit older.
Without question, 1962, 63. It was the coldest since 1740.
Wow.
And in the instrumental record, which goes back to 1659, it was the third coldest winter. So you had 1683 and 1740 and then 1962-63.
Didn't they invent the pools panel because there were no football matches?
Exactly, that's true. And it was a very long winter as well. It began on the 26th of December. It began snowing in London. I think there's pictures in the book when people read it where you see Horse Guards Parade absolutely paralysed by drifts. And there are quite a famous Press Association picture of somebody skiing down Maida Vale, towed behind a car. And it lasted till March, pretty much without a single break. And it was more severe in the southeast than it was in the north.
We tend to think of the north, and particularly the northwest, I guess, as much wetter. Is that true?
That's definitely
we're pretty
true.
Dry down here. What's the longest dry period? We're 76 again.
Yeah.
These things, because they do stick in our collective memories, don't they?
1976 definitely sticks in my memory because I think it's the first time where I've ever experienced anything quite like that. And never experienced it again, really, where it was just sunny from March pretty much through to September. The end of August. But we have had drier periods.
Really?
Yeah. I think the longest drought was in Mile End in London in 1893, and it was 9 weeks long.
9 weeks with no rain?
9 weeks without a single drop of rain. And much of southern England really, really suffered because the rest of the summer was quite hot as well.
So that's the Mile End Desert.
It was exceptionally dry. But the 76 period was followed a 12-month period before which had been dry. So you were getting consistently dry months, and then when the hot summer came, all the water evaporated. So
because what I remember about 76, and again, it may be a slightly kind of, rose-tinted spectacle view of it, was that not just was it dry, and not just was it warm, but it was bright sunshine.
Oh, it's fantastic.
And that's what you really long for, isn't it?
Yes.
Clear blue skies,
yes.
Bats on willows and all that, or whether it balls on willows and all that sort of it was one of those, the smell of freshly mown grass. It was that perfect English summer that almost never exists.
I was staying with my aunt in Wimbledon during a lot of that summer, and in the days when there was no TV during the daytime and I was 8, and you were desperate to be outside, it never rained. So we were outside all the time, and I don't think I've ever been so brown as I was at the end of that summer.
No, we became an outside people for an entire summer. The big wind of 87 when the trees fell down. I mean, you live in a place named after trees. Yeah. And I was saying that I remember walking out of my flat in Russell Square and half of the trees had gone. Yeah. Was that as unusual an event as we remember it?
It was. It really was. I think it was at the time cited as the worst storm since 1703. The 1703 storm was incredible and killed 15,000 people.
Wow.
A lot of them by sea, and I think they estimate that 250,000 people would have been the equivalent death toll now. Cool. So 1987 came second, and I think the only sort of positive was that it came at night, so it killed far fewer people than during the day. But it was exceptional, and it also happened...
what causes that? I mean, I know, it's difficult to talk of causal factors sometimes, but...
There were some fairly specific causes that. It had been a very warm, wet autumn, and there had been a lot of storms in the period before. So I remember doing a car rally in Sussex just the weekend before, and it was flooded everywhere. So it had been very, very wet, and the temperatures weren't dropping. So the water, when you got a very severe storm, meant that when it got into the part where it touches land and it died down, didn't happen. It actually drew slightly dry air, which created what they call a sting jet.
So you just bashed it. You're getting all animated there.
Getting excited. And that gave it an extra power as it hit land. And it also hit the south of England. So storms
did it hit us most hard?
It did, yes. I think anywhere from the south coast in a line up to East Anglia got hit hardest. So Folkestone all the way down to Brighton really got an incredible battering, the Isle of Wight, but it didn't really die down that much as it crossed land. And because it was early October, the leaves actually had most of their the trees had most of their leaves on, and with all the water, it just meant they were weak, so they just blew over in their millions. And I do remember at the time been practically speechless walking through Greenwich Park, seeing all those huge plane trees just lying across the road. It was really actually quite devastating for a lot of people and very surprising.
We get surprised. We were on air one day when we were surprised by a tornado in Kensal Rise. But we shouldn't be too surprised because they're actually relatively common, aren't they?
By area, the UK has the highest number of tornadoes.
It.
Yeah, but it's because they're relatively small. But occasionally we do get big ones, and the southeast of England, obviously the warmest part, gets the most severe thunderstorms. And thunderstorms create tornadoes, and we have had some whoppers in the past.
Real proper whoppers?
Yes, 1091, that's quite a long time ago, but that's the first recorded London tornado. It killed 2 people, and it destroyed St Mary le Bow Church.
Wow.
And apparently they know it was an F4 tornado because...
What's that? What's an F4 tornado?
So on a scale of F5 is those monsters you see in the States. This was an F4, so it was only one rung down from that. And they could measure that because when it tore the church to pieces, it flung the huge beams in the air, and they were only 4 feet of them, of a 26-foot beam, was protruding out of the ground.
Wow.
And it destroyed the first London Bridge. So that was the first sort of fatal tornado. It must have been huge to be reported and stay in the historical record this long.
Now, you mentioned frost fairs, and again, they're sort of part of London's collective mythology. Obviously, no one alive who can remember the Thames freezing over. Why does it not happen anymore?
There are several reasons.
London Bridge is one of them, isn't it?
London Bridge is one of them. I think that was a particular bottleneck, but it also coincided with what we call the Little Ice Age, and there was a significant dip in temperature from about 1540 that lasted until about 1900.
Do we know why, or just the patterns and systems?
It's very complex, and I think that's one of the problems with it. I could probably spend all day sort of going into some of the reasons, but broadly, since the last ice age, there have been 3 dips, and they are probably regular, but that was the most severe. And you were getting winters that were regularly below 0, which we just don't get anymore. And the ice packed along London Bridge, and it created these huge piles of ice. And people began having fairs on them, roasting oxes. In 1683, there's a lot of discussion of it. It was a massive frost fair that was there for 2 months, and they were riding coaches. But that was a very, very, very cold period, and it had a lot of negative impacts.
In what way? I think people dying and stuff.
People dying, but I think part of it was that they had what they called sea coal in those days, and when the air wasn't moving, there was anticyclones. You've got lots of poisonous smogs, and there was no water, so you couldn't find water anywhere in London because it was all frozen. And a lot of people really suffered for reasons like unexpected reasons like that. And, of course, a lot of people died from the cold. Fog.
That was, here in London, that was our kind of trademark. This was foggy London town. Yeah. Now, obviously, a lot of that was caused by pollution.
Yeah.
Other factors?
Not really. Not really. I think...
but surely they had equal amounts of pollution in Manchester, or as an industrial city, or in the Midlands, or whatever.
I think it was the concentration of particularly coal and industrial particulate matter and the size of the city meant that when there were fogs, they would be exacerbated and the sun couldn't break through. So 1962, immediately before that winter, there was the last smog, and it was exactly that. It was so dense, the actual brown vapour, that when it combined with the fog actually stays because it clings to the industrial particulate matter, and it just stayed.
And was that to do with coal burning fires? Or?
Yes, it was the combination of industry, but also the fact that most people burnt coal in those days because it was relatively cheap. So in 1956, they actually passed an act which reduced that. In 1968, they passed another one, and the statistics in terms of sunny days has gone through the roof since then. If you were here in 1960, you would have seen very few clear sunny days in central London compared to now, where you actually do have quite clear weather on occasion.
It's interesting because I mean, that sort of does coincide with my youth, and again, I'm sure it's the rose-tinted spectacles of looking backwards. But it seemed to be when I was a kid, and I was born in the 59, so I'm a child of the 60s. It seemed to be sunny all summer and snowing all winter, and I'm sure it wasn't ever. But, I seem to remember day after day of Grandad sitting with a hanky on his head and then day after day of mufflers and snow and sledges. And is that just me being romantic?
I think if you're talking about the 60s, probably. There would have been more snow in the winter, but the 60s is notorious for having some really nasty summers.
Really?
Yeah, I think 1962 was probably one of the coldest summers ever.
I'm probably thinking late 60s because that's kind of more when I was 8, 9, 10, that kind of age group.
It improved towards the end, but the 70s again weren't famous for good summers up until 75.
Well, 75 was a good summer, wasn't it? Yeah.
75 was an awesome summer, although it began with snow, June the 2nd. Yeah.
Snow in June? What's the latest snow we've ever had?
June the 2nd, 1975.
Wow.
And it was very, very famous for stopping the Test match at Lord's.
Snow on the Lord's Test match?
Yes. And within a week it was 29 degrees. And that sort of began a really lovely summer. 75 was a lovely summer.
Not the time or place to have an intense discussion about climate change, but if it does, if it's happening, and most people obviously assume it is, how is it likely to manifest itself here? Will my kids be seeing hotter weather? Will they be seeing wetter weather? What's the kind of prognosis, Doctor?
I think it's extremely difficult to say.
Is that one of the problems that we've had? That people have said things and then they haven't come true? Because at first we were given this idea, we're going to have a Mediterranean climate. Everyone was talking.
I do remember that.
Do you not remember that?
I think, like I was saying before, the unexpected things like the jet stream being stuck in completely different patterns for long periods, and actually the potential of having long periods of cold and long periods of hot, is a manifestation of a changing climate. And the other point I'd like to make is that the climate never hasn't changed. It has always been in flux. In the last 10,000 years since human development, it has been changing all the time. So this particular...
And before that, obviously, we know we had ice ages, we know we had all of those things.
Changing dramatically. I think the difference here is it's changing within our lifetimes and that we will have to adapt. I think the floods last year are probably fairly significant, where you've got the Somerset levels, where you've got reclaimed land. That's definitely under threat.
Has London flooded?
London flooded badly in 1953 when you had the East Coast storm surge. It came right up into central London, and that's provoked the building of the Thames Barrier. So those floods killed 2,000 people in Europe, 300 people just in the southeast of England. And that, I think, showed that the potential of a storm surge up the Thames was devastating. So
what causes those? I mean, again, without getting too technical, what causes that sort of scenario? Because it's not about rain, is it, necessarily?
No. That specific scenario was caused by a deep low pressure system coming down the North Sea, and it creates literally a dome of water, and on the sides of that sort of dip, the water is much higher than it would normally be, and when that hits land, you get... And it slows down like it's just like a tsunami.
It's like a sort of mini tsunami.
It begins to rise, and that particular time it was 17 feet high.
Wow.
And places like Ipswich and Norwich were absolutely devastated.
I know Whitstable down on the Kent coast
was completely submerged. Belvedere, Dartford... the Blackwall Tunnel was completely flooded. The power station at Dartford had to be shut down. It was, and a lot of people.
If the Blackwall Tunnel was flooded, I bet someone still broke down in it. Wouldn't stop it.
Having commuted through that tunnel, I concur.
How does that happen? How do people decide to break down the Blackwall Tunnel? Yeah. Of all places in the world where you can break down.
Yes, and normally at rush hour as well.
I know, it's bizarre. Yeah. Why? Clearly you are. Why are we so obsessed with the weather, do you think, in about the last minute of the interview?
I think because the British weather changes so much, and I think there's so much to it. Obviously, I'm maybe a special case in the fact that I passionately love weather and history combined, and I think that's where this book comes from.
Yeah.
But I think most British people love the excitement of the change. And we never know. If you live in California, it's going to be sunny, 22 degrees for the whole of February. We don't know from year to year, from month to month, from week to week, from day to day what we're going to get. And I think,
including the weather people half the time.
I won't condemn anybody there, but it is a very, very, I think, a relatively exciting climate.
And finally, how do barometers work?
Barometers...
Do they work?
Yeah, well,
everyone had one on their wall when I was growing up, and no one knew what they did.
They work. Well, there's a mercury barometer that works like a thermometer, and there's also sort of ones that work on springs. But now you've got digital ones. So I don't know is the answer exactly how a digital one works.
It's fascinating stuff. The book is called The Story of the British and Their Weather, and it is just that. It's a combination of history and weather, from frost fairs to Indian summers, by Patrick Nobbs. Patrick, thank you very, very much, sir.
You're welcome, thank you.
It's nearly 2 o'clock. It's time for the latest travel from Fiona McKinnon, and at some point we'll get the weather.
Thank you, Robert. BBC London 94.9. Here's the latest travel news. First with the roads